it's part of the MTFS, but actually, if you do transformation right, it actually, transformation is needed. Savings are a byproduct of our transformation because it's something you would want to do anyway to make services better, but also be more joined up as an authority and actually look at the technology and the AI and all the things that you want to do within that as well. If it was an additionality, given that it's in the MTFS, we do have to set a balanced budget in the MTFS. It's used as part of setting that balanced budget, yeah. Because otherwise, if we didn't include that 3 million, I'd have to find 3 million. We'd have to find 3 million elsewhere to set that balanced budget in the MTFS.
Last, I wanted to go further. Maybe this is done outside this meeting, and I should have sought some clarification in advance. I can see. Clearly, I acknowledge that, but the centre has been also obliged to save, let's say, £10 million this year, let's say, and it therefore has to change, reconfigure in order to make those savings. So those are savings we demand. It's required to set the balanced budget. I may have interpreted this 3 million to be, well, we've saved the 10 million, but we've also been able to save this additional 3 million because of improved technology, new ways of delivering, changes in processes and so on. And I wondered if that 3 million represented an enhancement over and above what is actually required to be saved.
It's not an enhancement over and above, but it's not a stopping point. So it's not we've reached the 3 million, we can now stop looking for savings. So for instance, there is an outline saving required, for instance, of the procurement work. At this point, we've still got a bit of work to do. We are confident we can overachieve that saving. We will continue to look for that saving and accrue it, and that means we get to take less savings elsewhere as part of the MTFS process. Yeah.
Okay, I think you've had your fair share, and in line with what Councillor Hartley says, I think we ought to move on. So thank you all for your contributions, and I think Stephanie's staying at the table. And Alfia, yes. So if Councillor King and Clive and Tim could come up, please. So if we could start by you all giving your name and position for the record, please. Thank you.
I'm Councillor Sarah King and Leader of the Council.
Councillor Stephanie Cryan, Cabinet Member for Equalities, Democracy and Finance.
Althea Loderick, Chief Executive of the Council.
Tim Jones, Director of Finance.
And Clive Boffman, Strategic Director.
I'm sorry for the delay, but obviously, we're very interested in the budget. Who's going to kick off? Yeah, okay, thank you.
I'll kick off. And I welcomed the delay because it allowed me to eat some crisps before I walked into the meeting, so much appreciated. I was just going to say a couple of words to just set us off. I also wanted to start by thanking the committee for bearing with me on my diary. I was conscious that I think the leader usually sets the scene at the beginning of the session, but unfortunately I had an urgent meeting to meet with Notting Hill Genesis, which I wanted to honour. So I think just to set off, I think over this period, I'm really conscious that we're coming to the end of an administrative 4-year term, and that's not to say it hasn't been without its financial challenges. And I'm conscious that you will have been going into the detail of some of those in the past, but also throughout today. But I think it really is important to say that this period of 4 years has been well managed, and that we have been able to plan effectively and robustly. One of those key reasons that has actually been about introducing 3-year budgets, so that we have been able to plan effectively and not have to make in-year difficult decisions that may have had to be made otherwise. I think it's important to say it's been made easier because the government understands that's how local government needs and must work, and that the government has really made a clear commitment to longer term settlements. Despite all of that, I am very aware of the life challenges that we face as a council. That's both in adults, but even more so in temporary accommodation. That temporary accommodation pressure is a significant one, and it's one that the council is rightly focused on, and one that I would say that I am personally anxious about. That's why we've been in so much regular dialogue with the government over the past year about making the case for greater levels of financial support for temporary accommodation, but also as a council being internally focused on what other temporary accommodation solutions can look like. Looking forward, we will all be very much aware of the fair funding work that the government has been doing, and the work that we've been doing as a council, and I've been doing as leader with Councillor Cryan, in terms of making the case for Southwark residents. Throughout the past 6 months in particular, that's been very much about communicating the exceptional high housing costs that we have in the borough and making sure that they were taken into account in the formulas that we were putting together. We were obviously updated just before Christmas how that settlement, how that consultation had developed, and it is looking still very, very difficult for us, and I'm under no illusion that that is the case. It is still a live consultation, and our lobbying and our work to make sure the residents of Southwark are reflected back to government continues. That will continue to focus in housing, but it will also focus on council tax collection, where we have some serious concerns about the rates that the government has put council tax, the rate of collection that the government is using is not the same as what we would expect as a local authority. I do also just finally want to touch upon the work that local government and the Mayor of London have been doing together. We've always believed that it's really important in this space to work together collectively as councils across London, but also with the Mayor. And we've very much been on the front foot in terms of looking at new and innovative ways to fund services. That's very much about, at this point in time, that's very much about taking a London-wide approach to the introduction of the overnight stay levy, and that is something that we will continue to do in terms of making the case both for it, but also for a 50% share between the Mayor and local government in terms of how that flows out. I will pause at that point.
Thank you. Stephanie, did you want to say anything?
No, because obviously Councillor King's covered the majority, and I touched on some of it earlier in the day, but I think, you know, one of the things that it's probably worth teasing out in this is the council tax and the assumptions of how much we can raise for council tax compared to what's been put into the settlement, because that is probably my biggest concern within the settlement around that. But I think, as Councillor King said, you know, the consultation isn't over yet. It is the provisional figure, and we have made representations back and responded to the consultation with that, and we'll continue to do so. I've had some really good dialogue with some of our MPs who are happy to raise questions in house as well on our behalf as well. So there's constant dialogue there as well. So we're using every lever we can to sort of just, you know, try and strengthen the case for us here.
Well, we've got enough of them now anyway. So. Do any of the officers want to add anything, Clive?
I guess starting on page 203 in the pack, there's a slide pack which just outlines what fair funding means for us. If you're happy, Chair, Tim was just going to pull out a couple of key headlines, then we open the floor out for questions.
The slides should now be appearing on the screen, if that helps. But it may be useful to have the paper copies as well. There's some small detail on a couple of the slides. I'll keep this fairly brief. I'm sure you can read the rest of this and ask questions. So in summary, there's a few slides just looking at the big picture stuff on the provisional local government finance settlement, and then that's followed up by a little bit of the impact on Southwark directly. In terms of the big picture stuff here, good thing here, 3-year funding settlement. First time we've had that in many, many years, so it's useful to have that certainty. Overall, there's been something like a 7.8% increase in real terms for the whole of local government across the England and Wales. And 3/4 of that, or nearly 3/4 of that, is assumed to come from council tax. So those are probably the kind of the big headlines. Interesting one to pull out on council tax, I suppose, just for a bit of wider context beyond Southwark. You know, all of London boroughs have been expected to raise their council tax, so our grant allocations are predicated on the assumption that we will be raising our council tax by the maximum amount. You'll notice the second bullet point down there, some boroughs in London are being permitted to raise their council tax by up to £150 over and above their 4.99% as part of this attempt to equalise council tax across the country. And then the third slide here, just on the bigger picture, really just giving a bit of historic context around where we are. Key lines to look at there, that second line down, it will not be easy to differentiate between the colours on your black and white copy, but certainly on the screen there, that second line down there, I think it's blue, showing the cash change since 2010 in core spending power. So cash clearly up 47.6% compared to when we started back in 2010. The big issue here really, certainly in recent years, has been the way that inflation has affected the spending power, affected the spending power of that money. And so the two lines at the bottom there, really, the second one from the bottom being the real terms change in the core spending power, and then the one below that being the real terms core spending power per capita. So effectively, how much money do we have adjusted for inflation per member of our population? And of course, what's not on that chart there is that the demand has increased over that same period, so things have become more difficult from that front. So clearly things are continuing to move in the right direction, but still remain below the level that they were at back in 2010. Moving on to Southwark now, three quick things to draw out here, really, which is how does Southwark fare relative to London? How do we fare relative to our own forecasts here? And then how are we faring relative to recent settlements? Again, whistle-stop tour here. This next slide, lots of detail. But effectively, it's showing you how the whole of London has fared. I guess it's important to draw out here, you'll have seen in the media a huge range of opinions on what the settlement has looked like for people. And really this slide here draws out why it's been such conflicting information, because actually it's been a settlement that's been entirely different for different boroughs, and there is no one picture across London. What you can see here is that we are just about in the middle of the pack, but certainly towards the bottom end of the pack in terms of how we fared. That chart on the right-hand side and that far right-hand column are showing our change in grants over the next 3 years, and the other two are showing some similar metrics. In terms of compared with our forecast, broadly where we thought we would land, the little chart on the left-hand side there is one that we've brought here before, showing what we expected, which was roughly flat funding. Big chart on the right here is showing it's slightly better than that. It's not quite flat funding, and it goes up a bit next year before declining in the following 2 years. So overall, in 3 years' time, we think we should be getting a settlement that's about £12.7 million higher than the settlement that we have in the current year. And what's important to draw out there is that 12.7 million, as we'll see on the next slide, is entirely comprised of our own generated council tax growth. So what you can see here is a chart just showing the relative proportions of our council tax and our grants. And it's just demonstrating over the next 3 years what we'll see is council tax growing annually from 155.9 million in the current year to about 189 million in 28-29, and the grant reducing. So over the next 3 years, we see an increase in council tax of about £33 million, offset by about a £20 million reduction in grants. So that's our 12.7 million of growth over the next 3 years. Final one, looking at Southwark specifically, really, is just showing the context in terms of recent history. What have we become used to as an organisation? What we've become used to as an organisation, certainly for the last 4 years, is those kind of middle 4 large green bars there, which shows that our grant funding has gone up year after year by somewhere between 17 and 25.9 million pounds consecutively for 4 years. And what we're seeing is that next year grant will go up again, by about £4 million, but is then expected to fall by a little over £12 million in each of the next 2 years. A brief slide here on council tax assumptions, but just to say that the government have used, understandably, averages to try and estimate what our council tax growth will look like over the next few years. They vary between boroughs, but we think that the estimates are quite optimistic for us, which may mean that the amount of council tax they think we can bill and collect is higher than we may well do in reality. So we'll need to do some more work on that. You're all familiar with the current year forecast. I think that's been referenced already. And final slide here to look at is a summary, which says, effectively, we're looking at flat funding for about the next 3 years. We know that our inflation generally runs at somewhere in the region of 30 million a year. Ergo, we end up with a budget gap of about £90 million. As we've said, next year's budget we're comfortable with. We're content that that will be balanced, and we'll be bringing a paper to Cabinet in February which will show that balanced budget. But certainly for the following 3-year period, we are looking at somewhere between an 80 and 90 million pound gap. I'll leave it there and allow time for questions.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Okay, I've got a couple of members who, yeah, okay. Right, okay, it's fine. Yes. So you missed earlier on, but I did pay thanks to all the work that you've been doing in relation to getting housing costs included within the government settlement, and also the work together with other London councils to prevent the Freedom Pass from disappearing, which probably I should declare an interest in. But anyway, and just to go back to government assumptions over council tax collection, I've never known the government not over-assume that we collect a high proportion of council tax. So anyway, there we are. Councillor Roberts.
My question was also about the council tax collection rates, and obviously there is a variation over what's collected within London, even amongst our neighbours. And I was just wondering if there is any kind of work going on about how we can increase that collection rate and how we can make it, reach the goal that the government is setting for us.
I was just going to say a quick bit first, and then I will. I think the first thing, in terms of the government's assumptions being over-optimistic, I think it is important that we clearly go back to the government to explain that over-optimism first. So I think there are things that I'll pass to Tim about in terms of actually collecting council tax. But I am acutely aware that some of the challenges we face around collection are due to the financial situations of our residents, and that what we want to also be doing is protecting them in this discussion and actually looking at ways that we can obviously continue with things like our hardship funds and our council tax reduction schemes. So I think the primary job is to engage with government about the rates being over-optimistic before we then look at the detail in terms of how we might also be able to increase collection rates.
Thanks. So just to add, yes, we have responded to the consultation. We have raised the issue of council tax, and we're discussing it with colleagues across London as well. It's an issue that's affected a few of us. Part of that reason is probably because the average that was taken would have included the years where we all, probably most of us, decided to apply the increased premiums for long-term empty homes. So in those particular years, there had been a significant boost in the tax revenue, but from the years afterwards, those increases would have gone up by the normal amount. So we think there may be some issues with the averaging there. In terms of actual collection, the team are always proactively reviewing things like discounts and exceptions to ensure that people are only getting them when they're entitled to them. All that sort of work is going on all the time as a year-round housekeeping exercise. And then finally, as a leader has mentioned, we're doing our absolute best to ensure that everybody who's entitled to council tax support is also receiving that.
Okay.
Well, it's coming around the council tax reduction scheme, because we're not proposing again for this year any changes to that. So it still remains one of the most generous ones. And we know across London councils, not through choice but through sort of necessity, have actually reduced the generosity of theirs around that. And we've made a conscious decision not to do that again this year. And that does cost us. It is expensive to do that, but we think it's the right thing to do around that. So we are continuing with, for obviously pensioners on low income who qualify, if they'd have to pay any council tax, but for working age adults, they can get up to 85% of their council tax in written off on council tax reduction schemes. And I think it's really important to sort of stress that whilst we're talking about council tax, that we're not doing what other councils have had to do, and as I said, not out of choice but out of necessity around that as well.
And that's what we said earlier in the day. That's what we're about, is helping people who are the most vulnerable and need it more than anybody else. Councillor Roberts, you want to come back?
I did, and it was to dig down into actually how we go about collecting the arrears if they are built up, and our use of all the tools that are available to us, including the use of bailiffs, where there is willful non-payment of council tax, which allows us to then continue our council tax reduction scheme. And I just want to make sure that we're carrying on by using all of those tools.
I think there's a massive difference in people who can't pay and people who won't pay. And when people can't pay, we need to be sympathetic and work with people, whether it's finding out whether they're entitled to exemptions or council tax reduction scheme, or coming up with plans that suit and meet they're able to pay some of it off if they are able to. The people who won't pay, absolutely, we do need to pursue that around that. And, you know, it is quite galling actually when you're sitting at council assembly meeting and a man starts shouting at you for using those tools for people who won't pay their council tax as well, because actually for those people who do pay their council tax, they expect anybody who can pay their council tax to be able to do so. But at the same time, also absolutely understand that those who can't, for various reasons, they would like us to have that support in place around that. So, yes, we do need to pursue those who won't. It's a very small number who won't, but there are people who just won't pay it and can pay it. And it's not fair on everybody else who does, to be quite honest with you, around that. So we do use the use of bailiffs as and when we use it sparingly, but we do. But we've also done really lots of good work around working with debt with our step-by-step programme, where actually what we look at debt as a collective. So we don't just look at council tax debt, we don't just look at rent arrears, because the chances are if someone's got rent arrears, they've also got council tax debt and vice versa. So we put that all into one debt, so they're paying the whole debt off rather than having to pay a bit here and a bit there. So we've worked around that. We worked with Step Change to look at debt support, and we're doing some really good work with the health service around supporting people when they go to their GP surgeries, and you know, debt is part of an underlying reason for maybe health conditions around stress and anxiety and things like that. There's us and Lambeth are working together with the health services around putting support in place there as well. And I was quite lucky to be at Parliament a couple of weeks ago around that and being invited to speak at that, and actually listening to some of the people who actually have benefited from the service, using that service, which is really quite moving, and actually saying the absolute difference and breathing space that it makes for them. So I think there's different ways we approach it, and it has to be people-centred and what matters to that person. But if you can't pay, if you can't pay, we will help you. But if you won't pay, I think that is a different thing altogether.
And presumably we adopt the same approach to chasing business rates as
well.
Yeah,
absolutely. For any debt, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Ottery.
Thank you very much. I think the projections on council tax was quite helpful. I think we've mapped out over the next, is it 3 to 4, 5 years, what we anticipate, based on information we know today, what we would need to increase, or what our income from council tax would look like. I think what would be super helpful, because I know we have quite a good track record of being able to make assumptions, and actually those assumptions are pretty much in line with what we expected. And I think given that information and our hope and our quest to be a transparent council, it would be really helpful if by bands we could break down what that projection actually would look like over a 3-year period, because at least for our residents, you'll really want to plan ahead and know, okay, what's coming up in the next year, 2, 3, notwithstanding the fact that could change if, of course, government grant that's given to us is much more favourable. But notwithstanding that, it would be just super helpful, I guess, from our perspective, to really granularize that information from, I think, £33 million you mentioned. I might have misread that. 33 million in terms of how much we'll receive in income from council tax. So just understanding what might that mean to the everyday man and woman paying their council tax over the next 3 years. Understand that it's just a projection. It isn't what's absolutely going to happen.
Absolutely. I suppose, I mean, it will be, all things being equal, it will be 4.99% more next year, and the same the year after, and the same the year after that, and unless you all decide collectively that it's not going to be that. So we, that piece of work is fairly simple, if that would be useful.
It'd be very helpful, because I was speaking to a gentleman this morning who said, look, he really hopes council tax doesn't go up again. And if it did, he would really want to know in the future by how much roughly. So if it's £150 we're paying today, what might that be by 2030? And then you can at least get residents who are able to pay, plan towards that. And those who aren't able to pay, we can start thinking about the statistical modelling, how we can support those who might struggle.
We'll see if we can get that put. I'm not sure about the timeframes now, but we'll see if we can put that into the cabinet report for February, or definitely at least for the council assembly.
Something's just indicative, really. I mean, obviously we can't be.
The only thing we can't factor for is with mayoral precept, because we don't know how much. But in terms of what we have, if we were looking at all things being equal and it's 4.99 each year, then yeah.
Excellent. I've got Councillor Von Wiese.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much for the overview. I know we haven't talked about the housing a budget in detail, so maybe some of this will, it's not me, come later. No, I'm just, first a question to Tim. You mentioned that you're hoping to balance the budget. There is a 26 million overspent already. This is mainly due to temporary accommodation. I think 18 million of that is temporary accommodation. Can you just explain how is that going to go away? And if it's not, does that mean that we're carrying over another 26 million into next year's budget where we already have a 90 million projected deficit? So does that mean that in reality it's going to be way over 100 million deficit? Where is this going when the main root cause seems
sorry
to
to
be
stop
in
you,
housing?
but that's the next section. We've got the specific section of this meeting.
Okay, so it's just a general question on are we going to balance our budget by the end of this year?
The specifics will be dealt with in the next section. I'm not going to have duplication in this meeting.
Okay, so where are we going? Are we actually going to balance this budget? And a question to the leader, if I may, what kind of pressure have you applied, Sarah, on central government to get to a better outcome, a fairer outcome for this settlement? And I know this is your government. Thank you.
So in terms of, if I take out the housing element, yes, temporary accommodation is our largest overspend, but we have other overspends as well, some of which you've already discussed this morning. So within the budget, we have what we call risk reserves, which gives us a little bit of resilience against areas that we know are facing elements of demand, and we will apply them alongside. We'll make decisions over the course of the year in terms of application of those risk reserves, given what you've already heard this morning around the mitigation activity that we've had in adults and children's to bring down some of their challenges, and some of the activities we've got planned in the housing space that I'm sure Hakeem and other colleagues will talk to you a little bit later on this afternoon about. And then we'll allocate out to those corporate contingency reserves and budgets, sort of funding for any residual overspend. Yeah, so that's how we balance the budget at headline level. Councillor King, pick up the question around lobbying.
Thank you, and thank you for the question about what we've been doing to government. I think it's I'm very happy to recap it. There has been a huge amount of lobbying effort from myself and Councillor Crine in terms of representing Southwark's interests. That's been directly to our members of Parliament, of which we have 5. It's been directly to ministers, it's been in conjunction with the Mayor of London, and it's been through London councils and through Central London Forward. We are still in a really difficult place, and I'm not here to pretend that we are not. I do think that there was an understanding and a change made to the housing formula in terms of taking into account the exceptional high housing costs that we have, but there is still some way to go. I am conscious that it is our government that we are talking to about these challenges, and from a political perspective, I would want to have seen a fair funding formulas work across the country where no local authority was going to lose out, rather than the redistribution of the pot of local government funding. What's really difficult is that our government has inherited an economic disaster and isn't able to actually increase the entire funding of local government to get where I would like to be. But going forward, we will continue to make the case for Southwark residents, and that is very much focused at this stage of the consultation on council tax collection, but also in making the case for the overnight stay levy.
Thank you. Councillor Chamberlain.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sure, like me, those members of OSC that have sat on the committee for a number of years in this meeting will remember that we were told that a Labour government was going to be the answer to all our prayers. Well, the reality clearly is that has not become the case. Is it not the reality that Labour is just not listening to Southwark? Despite what you're saying about
representing,
about the budget? Yeah, it is. It's about the strategic direction.
We'll get to the question. Please.
You say you're lobbying MPs, but Bermondsey's MP was putting out misinformation about how this budget settlement is actually going to benefit Southwark. The reality is that the £26 million we're facing this year is just a third of the black hole that we're facing over the next few years. So how can residents have any assurance that this council has its finances in a good order, and that this is a government that is listening to the borough? And how can we be assured that that £90 million isn't going to get worse, given that we haven't been able to manage a 3-year budget, and we are now £26 million over, despite a Labour government having been in post now for 18 months and not delivering for Southwark?
So I think it's always hard when your budgets have been cut to the bone for 15 years. And if we weren't in a position that the coalition government put this in, with constantly stripping down our budget at that point, we would have more resilience. Yeah. So you've got to look at where it started from. It didn't start with the current Labour government. It started back in 2010. It started then when local authority budgets were stripped and stripped and stripped, and around that. Because it took away resilience. It absolutely took away resilience. I'm really proud of what we've done as a council, as an administration. I'm really proud because we have not had to go for emergency special funding. We've managed our budgets around it. Yes, we do have overspends, but we have risk reserves to cover that. We know that. We are on top of where we are with it. We've been pretty resilient around that. And we've managed to keep frontline services going. And not only have we managed to keep frontline services going, I mentioned earlier about free swim and gym. We are providing support for those residents who need it most. Free healthy school meals, we've been paying for those as well. We've been opening new libraries, we've been opening new leisure centres, all in a backdrop of the initial austerity which stripped our budgets. And we've got a government who inherited a mess from the previous government. They inherited a mess in the economy. As Councillor King said, yes, we would like more money, and yes, we would like to see a situation where no government lost out around this. But the truth of the matter is that local government's been constantly stripped and stripped and stripped. So you cannot blame a fair funding settlement this year for 15 years or 14 years of mismanagement of the nation's finances. And that's my starting point on this, is that yes, we do have to look at budget gaps, and yes, we do have to make hard decisions, but we've been making those tough decisions in the background of austerity throughout that. And if it hadn't been for austerity, it hadn't been for the coalition, their ideology about stripping local government, we would be in a stronger position.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson.
Can I come back?
Well, if you've got a question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question as well about the overnight levy that you mentioned as well, Sarah. Can I ask why Southwark's only asking for 50% of that levy? Is that not, actually, selling ourselves short when we are as a local authority having to take up quite a lot of the flak for having so many tourists in our area?
Thank you, Councillor Chamberlain. So I think the point with the levy, is that making a clear case for 50% within the context of fair funding. I do think we also need to acknowledge that the Mayor does also deliver services which are services within our borough. So that the money that is generated in the mayoral part of the overnight stay levy is then spent in, some part of it is also spent in Southwark too. So it's not that we lose 50% of the levy from Southwark to the Mayor for good. We will be obviously making the case for him to look at how he resources policing in the borough. We will be looking at how the Mayor can spend money on housing in the borough. So I think it would be incorrect to talk about the 50% we're not asking for as a loss for Southwark residents. It is for Southwark residents, but it will be spent through the Mayor's processes and in conjunction with the London boroughs in terms of those negotiations. So we will make the case for the 50%, but we will always make the case for the Mayor of London to spend that money in our borough too.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Johnson.
Thank you. I hope my questions are in the right space. I've got two actually. And Steph, thank you for saying emergency special funding, because that was the thing I couldn't think about. So it's hard going through this. Obviously, I don't deal with the council finances day in, day out, whereas you do. So you're from a lot more. The language is second nature to you. The budgets are second nature to you. It's not the same for me, and it's not the same for our residents. So looking at the presentation that's put together, which actually thank you, because you've condensed a lot of information into a very small space. So the budget gap remaining of 80 to 90 million. So we're obviously projecting that over the next, 3 years or so? So if you're going to have a hole in our budget of that size, which is significant, and obviously we don't know what the government isn't going to do in terms of helping to fill it, and the reliance on council tax to fill that budget, does that potentially mean that we will be moving we are at risk of moving towards the emergency special funding or having to look at the referendum limit to try and go above the 4.99% council tax increases, which, you know, for if inflation goes as planned and we keep council tax increases at that rate, they will continue to be above inflation, which will, you know, will have quite a big impact on our residents anyway, because their housing and other costs will be above inflation to some extent. So that's one question. Just in terms of me having an understanding of what that 80 to 90 million could look like as in the future for risk. And then the other one comes back to the point about the overnight stay levy. And obviously, I've just been thinking about my summer holiday this year, and I was looking at a certain online app where you can book accommodation through. And in some countries where they have the overnight levy, it will mention that on there. And I suppose if we have the overnight levy, would that be used by the council to some extent as intelligence to identify where there's illegal subletting of our properties? That's just something to think about, because actually there's a big issue nationally with social housing being abused, and would that be something you would use?
I think the answer to the same question is yes. So,
Actually, we might not be able to, because depending on legislation, that might be used
yes,
for it.
Yes, absolutely right.
I think in terms of illegal subletting, if whatever we can use, I think we should be using it. We do rely a lot of intelligence around that on our residents, actually. And I think us as councillors around the room, it's incumbent on us when one of our residents represent tells us they think there may be a legal sublet, it's just to report it anyway, because even if it's not, it will be investigated around that or on that. So if we can, absolutely, I think we should and would around that, because, you know, as you said quite rightly, you know, our council homes are, you know, we've got quite a lot of people on our waiting list, and we need our council homes. They were built for council, you know, for tenants, and we not as holiday homes around that. I mean, we did do something a few years ago, which we were the first local authority to do that, where we said that actually we wrote to every leaseholder and every tenant to say it was absolutely illegal to do that, and we would take action as and when we found that out as well. And we have been doing that as well around that. Yeah, and illegal sublets are quite pertinent in press at the moment, aren't they, as well. In terms of the budget gap, I'm going to hand that over to Clive. I think we've planned, you know, we've known for a while, and can I just say, you know, I just want to say thank you to Clive, Tim and Geraldine and the team, because now we have the certainty of a 3-year settlement, so we know what we're going to get for the 3 years. But we had set a 3-year budget based on 1-year settlements, and every single time the team have been absolutely brilliant in more or less predicting where we would end up in the settlement and what we would need to do and where our gap would be. And we've been looking at this and this gap for quite a long time now, even before the settlement was announced. So we've got, you know, the team are really pretty spot on with that. So we've been aware of this for quite a period of time and what we may need to do around, but we haven't sort of finalised it. It'll be next year we come to you with what our finalisation is for 27-28 budget, but they've always been really, really good about that, and we've not had to use that ESA or the council tax referendum limit around that. I don't think, in terms of the council tax referendum limit, I mean, my gut feeling is that if we were to do that, we would be one of those 6 councils named, and we're not. We still have the 8th lowest council tax in London, and one of the lowest nationally, actually, because if you look out of London, actually their council tax rates are higher than ours anyway. I think we're 9th lowest nationally, and even with the 4.99%, we'll still be in that position because other local authorities are potentially raising theirs the same. I think there are a few little anomalies around that as well. I mean, in terms of ESA, we're not at that stage yet, are we, Clive? Clive hasn't told me we are, so I'm assuming we're not on that. And I'd like to think he'd tell me if we were, and I know he would. So it's going to be tough. Look, it's going to be tough, and we're going to have to look at what decisions we need to make, which we're working through at the moment. But just to reassure, at this moment in time, there are no plans.
Well, I think we've got a good record of actually being very prudent with the council's finances, and, you know, having good custodianship of what we do with our borough finances compared to, say, Croydon and other places. So I think we can hold our heads up high. Councillor Leeming.
I welcome Councillor Chamberlain's comments about politicians spreading misinformation, and would invite him to condemn the lies being told by his candidates in Dulwich Village Ward about the work of myself and Councillor
stick to the topic.
Moving on from that, building on the talk about the tourism tax that we've just been talking about, this is the direction of travel for this government, which is obviously better to have a government that you can talk to rationally and calmly and well, and we have good relationships with. And they are looking to carry on devolving finances to local authorities. Do you anticipate over the rest of this term of the Labour government and indeed the next one that there will be further opportunities granted to us to raise charges in a way that is good for us but less harmful for our residents?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things I've noticed is, so I am a member of the Local Government Association Labour Group. I sit on one of their boards, and what I've noticed since the Labour government coming in is the absolute fact that ministers come in and speak to us, and we have that, there is that dialogue, and actually the executive of the LGA Labour Group have that absolute regular dialogue with ministers in a way that wasn't before. You know, I'm at the Labour Group meeting next week, and there'll be ministers there coming along and the opportunity to ask questions around that as well. So that there's more of an openness than there has been in the past, and I can only see that continuing. I can't see the drawbridge being drawn up on that as well. So from my perspective in my role, I've seen that. I know that Councillor King would have seen it a lot more than me. I was given her role.
Thank you, Councillor Codd. I think the decision taken very recently about the Freedom Pass is a really good example, I think, of Labour in different parts of local government, the Mayor of London working together to achieve an aim for our residents. So that dialogue across Labour London leaders is very strong. The work that we're doing directly with the Mayor of London is also a very good and regular relationship in terms of talking about what the challenges are that we all face and how to fund them. I think Councillor Crine's point about resonance with ministers is really important. We don't have to go into meetings now and explain what temporary accommodation is, and we don't have to explain what the poverty is that people experience. So we understand what each other's pressures are, and I think we all have a very, very strong agreement that if the economy was doing better, we wouldn't have to make such difficult decisions. I think going forward, where I think the conversations will continue positively are on the impact of temporary accommodation costs. That is a live conversation in terms of what the solutions are that government could give us to make things easier. I think they sit in two separate camps. There is one about funding and how we purchase temporary accommodation, but I also think there's a bit about alleviating the pressures in terms of the people who are facing temporary accommodation needs. Decisions have already been taken that will help in that space. So things like the Renters' Right Act is a really positive move that we have seen from the government in terms of protecting our residents in private accommodation. The other very live conversation is about the funding of special educational needs. We know, I can remember when I was first elected, SEND was not an issue you got on the doorstep, but it is now increasingly one that actually affects our residents in such acute ways we pick it up as casework. That is a very live conversation, and Councillor Ali was in a meeting with Georgia Gould, the Minister, last week to be talking about the pressures that we are facing. So I think where Councillor Crine started about understanding each other's pressures and what our residents need is very, very positive, and the dialogue is regular, and I hope we will be able to update as we go forward in terms of some positive announcements, particularly in SEND and TA.
Thank you. Councillor Seaton.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation responses to your earlier questions. So my question is really about understanding figures, and you must forgive me if I'm having difficulty sometimes understanding some of the figures. The last slide that was shown earlier on, what does it mean, identified a funding gap between 80 to 90 million over a 3-year period annually. Okay, so I understood. It also mentioned that contract and salary inflation running at 30 million annually is another minus figure, potentially increasing the deficit by, if we say, by another 30 million. And you also, in the earlier slide, mentioned that the council tax assumptions. You're assuming the government has been overly optimistic, and you're forecasting 15 million less. Those cumulative figures then suggest, therefore, that the figure annually is at least 30 million or so more than the funding gap suggests. Am I right in that assumption?
I'll take that one. So, Councillor, assumption within all of this is that our funding, the combined sum of our grant funding and our council tax, will essentially stay flat for the next 3 years. So the growth in council tax of say 15 million, say 30 million pounds or so, is offsetting a reduction in grant by about 20 million. So that, on the face of it, looks like in 3 years' time we'll have about 12 million pounds more in our budget than we would do in the current year. We think it will be lower than that because we think our council tax will be less. So crudely, we're looking at our funding staying broadly flat over the next 3 years, give or take a few million pounds.
Give me to interrupt, but my viewpoint here is that you're suggesting there would be 50 million less, and therefore the actual figures you're actually telling us is 50 million less than the figures you just quoted.
So over the course of the next 3 years, we think what we will bill could be something like 15 million pounds less, but that would be something like 5 million pounds a year cumulatively. So maybe we might collect 5 million less next year and 5 million the year after that and 5 million. So it would add up to about 15 million pounds of lost potential revenue. In terms of the recurring annual budget, we think overall it's going to be near enough flat. I mean, if you look at the numbers, it looks like it goes slightly down, but we think it's going to be roughly flat over the next 3 years. So with that said, assuming our funding remains exactly as it is right now for 3 more years, each year contracts and salary inflation will cost us an extra 30 million. So next year we need to find 30 million pounds of savings just to cover off the increase in salaries and contracts, and the following year the same and the same again.
Contracts are plus as opposed to minus, in other words. Contract inflation is a plus rather than a minus.
Yes, it adds costs to our base, yes.
Great, I'm glad we've worked that one out. Thank you very much. There's no more questions, so thank you for your contributions. And we'll move on to the next section, please, if we may, which is the HRA and temporary accommodation. I'll get you to ask the first question. If the members and officers would like to come to the table, please. Okay, is that everybody? Yeah. Okay, so to begin with, for the record, could you please state your names and positions? Thank you.
There we go. Councillor Portia Mwanganji, Cabinet Member for Council Housing.
Hi everyone, I'm Councillor Helen Dennis, I'm Cabinet Member for New Homes and Sustainable Development.
Hakeem Oshinaki, Strategic Director Housing.
I think I've seen you before. Okay, would you like to make your presentations, please? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to just kick off to talk about temporary accommodation. So this wasn't an area where we had proposed savings this year or indeed over the 3-year budget. It is an area of really sustained pressure on the general funds, as you would have seen from the paperwork. It remains a really challenging picture across London, with £5.5 million spent every day by London councils on temporary accommodation. It's clearly not where anyone wants to be. It feels like a huge amount of money for very poor outcomes, when what we really want to be doing is finding sustainable long-term housing solutions for people in need. There are pressures on both the kind of supply and the demand side. So there are more and more people who are seeking temporary accommodation. London now has 210,000 homeless households, 102,000 homeless children. And the average cost of temporary accommodation has also been increasing. So over the last 5 years, we've seen an increase of 75% on average in the costs of temporary accommodation. So the council's financial position essentially reflects these challenges on both sides. We currently have, I think, 4,239 households in temporary accommodation. So it's a really huge number. The team are doing a lot of work on the prevention side. So really trying to meet people who are presenting with housing needs at the earliest possible opportunities. And there have been various things put in place operationally as well, to ensure proper sign-off of temporary accommodation, and also to ensure that we're negotiating hard on nightly paid costs. We're trying to reduce the amount of nightly paid accommodation as much as possible, and we have actually been successful in getting the price down over the last year of the average amounts per night that we do spend. But we do still have historic agreements which are very expensive, and so we are trying to target those as well and move people out of the most expensive accommodation. So a lot of work going on that side. In terms of other things that we're trying to do to bring down costs, on the supply side, we are using a significant amount of estate-based accommodation, particularly on the Aylesbury estate, as people will know, and we have plans to bring some more accommodation back into use from the latter stages of the Aylesbury regeneration, so that that is used productively for temporary accommodation in the short to medium term. It's worth saying, I think, that this is also why there are schools in the vicinity of the Aylesbury estate where there are very significant numbers of children who are in temporary accommodation. But this is because we've made the decision to keep people in borough near their support networks using estate accommodation rather than sending people further afield. And of course we have committed, as I think the committee know, not to use bed and breakfast accommodation for families, which is the thrust of where the government's homelessness strategy is going as well, because they're wanting to eradicate the use of bed and breakfast accommodation for families in particular. So a lot of work going on both sides. We've also got money from the local authority housing funds to bring forward a number of units, including modular accommodation and buybacks for homeless families. We were just celebrating the new modular units on Leroy Street, just around the corner, in London Bridge, West Bermondsey, which is a kind of expansion of our Housing First offer, which we're really proud of. So there are some really positive things that are going on, but I think that the overall picture clearly remains really, really challenging. We've got a projected in-year variance, which is significant. I think it's 14.2 million after use of reserves. That clearly can't continue forever and a day. It's really significant. And so whilst I think when you actually look at the work that's been done over the last year by the team, it's actually pretty impressive stuff. And we have managed to actually get the variance to reduce the projected variance over the last few months because of the targeted prevention work that's being undertaken. But we remain in dialogue, as the leader was saying, with MHCLG, with colleagues in government, about the need to reduce temporary accommodation costs, because clearly ourselves and lots of other local authorities can't sustain that amount of money and that amount of pressure on the general funds.
Okay, great. Did you want to add anything to that, Hakeem? No?
No, Chair.
Okay. Portia, do you want to make your presentation, please?
Yeah, so I would just like to start by drawing back to where we were. We had a £15.4 million pound overspend in 23 and 24, but we've reduced that down to 4.7 million, and we are predicted to also basically eliminate that by March. And we've done this through efficiencies and making sure that we meet the requirement by the housing regulator to make sure that we're using our value for money, so redirecting resources where they are most needed. Where we are at the moment, we would like to be in a position where our rent policy allows us to be in a position where our income that we're generating allows us to actually take care of our housing stock. But being one of the biggest housing social landlords in the UK, also dealing with inflation hitting the housing sector really, really badly, and new regulatory and very welcomed, by the way, burdens which were not brought in with funding, we are having to direct our resources to things like our building safety and fire safety work, which is being done as a part of our major works programme. But seeing where we've come from in terms of the amount of overspend that we have and the way that we're reducing it and making sure that we are getting value for money for the work that we're doing, I think is a very, very good story about our HRA recovery plan that we put into place. Where we would like to be, if you look at our Better Repairs programme, we are forecasting to basically save £3 million through that over the next 2 years. And that is making sure that we are decreasing our subcontractor spend, and making sure that our direct level organisation force is actually doing the work that they need to do in order to do our repairs, and also avoid turnaround, making sure that we are bringing in income through our voids.
Lovely, and congratulations on the success of the recovery plan, and congratulations to yourself on your new portfolio at the same time. I obviously you mentioned about the fallout from the Grenfell fire and the fire safety regulations, but also there's also the environmental sustainability requirements as well that is causing a strain on the housing stock. So who wants? Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Councillor Von Vliet.
Thank you. Further to my premature question in the earlier session. Abolish these things. Thank you very much for the presentation. I wish I could be as optimistic about the success of the recovery plan for the housing budget, but I'm just looking at the numbers, and just looks really worrying. We have 4,200 and something households in temporary accommodation, which clearly is just patching up a really big problem here. We have 2,500 or so roughly empty homes in the borough. We have scandal after scandal in major repairs, major works and repairs that we hear from our residents, where money is wrongly spent. And at the same time, at least in the north of the borough, where I am a ward councillor, we see hundreds and hundreds of new commercial office space approved by this council. And I mean, I realize that the alternative would probably be, mostly unaffordable homes. But the truth is that we just need more homes, because for every home we build, we free up resources for affordable social homes to be built, which are currently not built. So can you please explain to me where this is going in the future, with or without recovery plans? How do you project this going on the same trajectory without the HRB going bust within the next 5 years or so? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Von Wees. To be clear, we need to separate the Housing General Fund from the Housing Revenue Account, because the temporary accommodation situation is in the General Fund, because it's a statutory responsibility of the council, as it separates from the council's function as a landlord. The issues around temporary accommodation are national. It's not an issue that is related to Southwark only, and it has nothing to do with our inability to manage it. In fact, the opposite is the case. As Councillor Dennis referred to earlier, there's been a lot of good work in our homelessness service over the last 12 to 18 months that has arrested what was a very concerning situation. Whilst our trend is, when you look at the figure, I agree with you. One, there are far too many households in temporary accommodation. We don't want that. When you look at the cost of it, it's also too high. We don't want that either. However, when you look at our trend, it's been getting better in the sense that our prevention, because homelessness, at the end of the day, what you don't want is people going into temporary accommodation. You want to identify the issue at the earliest possible opportunity, and assist or support those families before they even become homeless. We have increased our efforts in doing that by 28% over the last year alone. So all of those people would have gone into temporary accommodation, and they haven't. And they haven't suffered the trauma of homelessness, which is the primary issue here. The trend, when you look at it nationally, is going the other way. So I want to commend my team in the homelessness service for the work that they've done. Because as a local authority, our responsibility is to support these families, as I said earlier, to make sure that they don't even have to face the trauma of homelessness. But homelessness is inevitable, excuse me, unfortunately. And when they come to our door, then we do our absolute best, to support them. And temporary accommodation cost has gone up significantly across the whole country. And we're in central London. So, it's inevitable that when people go into temporary accommodation, there will be a cost to it, and the cost to us will be high. We'd rather not pay that because we'd rather people didn't have to go into temporary accommodation at all. But as I said, you would hear it almost on a regular basis as part of the news that the trend on homelessness nationally is very concerning. But we're doing our best in Southwark to manage it well.
Chair, if I just make a comment on two things. One is that there is obviously a relationship between the money that is brought in through office development and the growth that generates and the general fund and temporary accommodation. So money that comes in through business rates is money that goes into the general fund. So there is a relationship there. And I think it's important to recognise that because council services rely on that growth, which is generated through not just housing and council tax, but also business rates. There is a particular point, I think, on empty homes. We have done a lot of work in detail through our Empty Homes Action Plan to look at things on a kind of a state-by-state basis. We have a clear priority, as Councillor Mungenje outlines, around void turnaround times. We know that needs to improve. We have been working to get the process right, to put resources into that. So that is absolutely a top priority. But a lot of the homes which are counted within those figures are part of estates renewal programmes. So things like Heversham House, for example, on the Tustin, where at the moment we have people moving into their new homes and creating vacancies for a property which is then going to be and due to be demolished due to its lack of decency. Similarly, Bromyard House on the Ledbury estate, also Marie Curie and the Chair's Ward, where there are significant fire safety issues and where people have had to move out. And then, of course, the properties on the Aylesbury, a lot of Aylesbury Phase 2B, where we have a legal obligation to secure vacant possession before handover to Notting Hill Genesis. Obviously, we have had to go through a process of moving people into new homes so that we can secure vacant possession. But until demolition occurs, those homes are included within the empty home statistics. So I suppose all I would say is, yes, we know that we need to do more around voids, but the headline figure needs to be interrogated so that we can fully understand where there is potential for homes to be brought back into use, for refurbishment, for turnaround, and where there are quite significant amounts of properties where they are not in a position to be able to be occupied at the moment.
If I just touch on a few things around the HRA, because you mentioned, Councillor Van Wees, about pressures on the HRA and your concerns about the HRA going bust. Just to be clear, a number of things have happened, to social landlords, particularly local authority social landlords, over the last few years, that has affected the amount of money we have to maintain our homes. A lot of government policies reducing rent over a period of time. And then, additional pressures, burdens that we have had to deal with without any extra funding, because the rent is the rent at the end of the day, but with new things added to spend that rent on that we didn't have to. And I'll give you a good example. Building safety regulator. It's a completely new thing, and we have to pay for them to assess each of our blocks. We didn't have to do this, 2 years ago, and we've got 194 high-rise buildings in Southwark. So considering how much they charge for each block, and when you multiply that by the number of blocks we've got, that amount of money is money we no longer have to invest in our stock, and that's just one example. And it goes on and it goes on, so every year we're having to find a more efficient way of doing things, which is not such a bad thing. But we would be in a better place if those new burdens were funded in the same way they are funded for general fund services. When a new legislation is made for homelessness, for example, that is going to cost local authorities money, government will usually give us money to meet the cost of delivering that new burden. They don't do that for the HRA, which is not great because tenants who pay rent expect to get a service for the rent they pay. But if we're having to do more things with that money, that means they're getting fewer things from what they expect.
I could just say, I mean, historically, that's been the case ever since the 1980s. When Mrs. Thatcher abolished the GLC, we inherited all the GLC estates in the borough, which doubled our housing stock overnight, but not a single penny came with it. So we had half the budget for the whole of the housing estates and properties in this borough to actually service it, and we've been in that situation ever since.
A quick follow-up. Thank you very much. I just wanted to hear from Councillors Dennis and Mangange whether you agree with the Director of Housing that from a political perspective in particular, that homelessness is indeed inevitable.
I don't think he meant it in that way. I think you're distorting his words. What he meant to say is there will always be people presenting themselves. That's what he meant.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Any other questions? Councillor C.
Maybe just to follow on from this, just for clarification's sake, the numbers of families who are presenting to Southwark, the landlord of last resort, is a result of rental inflation in the private sector in the main, or indeed are they existing tenants who have failed to pay their rent? Which is the two?
So the number one reason for homelessness approaches in our borough is informal arrangements ceasing. So children who have been asked to live by their parents or who can no longer live with their parents, friends falling apart or falling apart, informal relationships breaking up. Is the main reason we have homelessness applications. However, we have seen and continue to see a significant increase in the number of people approaching us because they have been evicted from private rented accommodation. And there are a number of reasons for that. The rent in private rented accommodation is continuing to go up to the point that most people can't afford it. So a lot of these people are having to leave not because they haven't paid their rent, but because they can no longer afford the rent that their landlord is offering. And then in a second situation is that the individual landlords in the market are leaving the market, because of policy changes affecting that the way they rent their homes, and that also means that because as part of preventing homelessness, we seek private landlords to assist in providing accommodation to people who have approached us as homeless. But because those private landlords are selling their accommodation, we're unable to access those homes, and therefore we're seeing an increase in the use of temporary accommodation.
Sorry, Helen.
So I just wanted to add on to that. So as Hakeem was saying, the kind of primary reason is, as he said, the eviction from friends and family. In some respects, I don't think that's that's unexpected. Southwark has got the largest percentage of social housing, we think, as anywhere in the country. 40% of households in Southwark live in social housing, according to the last census. And so as a result of that, it is maybe unsurprising that evictions from friends and family for people maybe on lower incomes is higher in Southwark than elsewhere. But the second highest cause of homelessness presentations is evictions from the private rented sector.
Councillor Tree.
Question that might lead on to the next part of the agenda in terms of thinking of recommendations, but this might inform it, is around the point you made, Helen, on the majority of children living in temporary accommodations being around the Aylesbury. Is that correct? Did I miss here?
Not the majority, but we've made a decision to use Aylesbury stock for temporary accommodation in quite significant amounts. there is often, I think, reporting around schools like Surrey Square and the numbers of children in temporary accommodation in the Peckham area and the Aylesbury area. That, I suppose my point is the reason that that is the case is because otherwise, if we were dispersing those families and children, we might have lower numbers of children in those schools in temporary accommodation. But in some respects, that results from a choice, and I think it is the right choice in terms of keeping people in borough and close to their support networks.
I think you hit the nail on its head, and that was where I was going to, and thinking about work, understanding work you've done with local schools, because ultimately, if they're in temporary accommodation, if children are in temporary accommodation and they're going to schools like, as you mentioned, Surrey Squares and other nearby schools, the pupil premium of those schools in the near future could well drop if we were to solve the issue in quite quick order. And so then we'll start to get in the territory of are those schools viable anymore or not, being open or maybe being amalgamated with one another. And I just wanted to understand what work's been done with education colleagues to assess what that impact might be. And if no work's been done, I mean, that's not fine, but it's understandable for us as a committee in maybe seeing where we go with recommending what we could do to maybe push on that point.
Yeah, I don't think that's a likelihood anytime soon around the Aylesbury, to be honest. As I kind of mentioned earlier, we've got plans to bring Taplow back into use in the short to medium term for temporary accommodation. So there will be, I think the issue there will be more about ensuring that there is adequate support in place as kind of new people move onto the estate. And as you said, working with the schools. I know that work has been ongoing. We could potentially do more around that. And it's something I've chatted with the team about. In terms of the impact on school places more broadly, it is certainly something that is taken into account in the pupil place planning report. We had that just come to Cabinet recently, and it looks at the kind of trends across the different areas. And obviously, like our expectations around new housing, estate renewal, etc., that all needs to be factored in and built into the equation when we're thinking about that. I think that the main challenge there has been the private rented in terms of falling school roles, has been the private rented sector and people not being able to stay in the borough from that point of view. Because as I said, the actual levels of social housing have broadly sustained because of our house building programme. But clearly there are a lot of people who feel priced out and unable to stay, who can't access social housing.
Chair, if I can beg your indulgence, just one final thing.
Keep begging.
Sorry. Just on fire risk assessment. So you mentioned that it's not temporary accommodation being needed isn't something that will go away anytime soon, specifically for the areas that we're speaking about. But relating to fire risk assessment, we know that the landscape there is ever changing. And let's just assume that in 2-3 years' time, the fire regulations have been updated and places like the Aylesbury were no longer viable to live in. Have we done any kind of planning around that and what that situational analysis might mean for some of the issues that I'm talking about, such as pupil places falling and the impact of the schools, just in relation to fire risk assessment? Because I know it's quite a live situation and something that Councillor Ian Wingfield and I have to deal with almost frequently in areas such as Sow Gardens.
Okay. Thank you for that, Councillor Cherry. On school places, I think it's important to stress, that the situation or the plan on the Aylesbury is to replace those homes with better quality homes and more of them. So, going forward, I can't see a threat to school places on the Aylesbury because, the families living there at the moment either will be able to continue living there in new homes or other families will move into those new homes when they're built. In terms of the fire regulations as it affects the properties now, the building safety legislation, as we know it currently, and it's fresh, tells us what we need to know about the blocks on the Aylesbury, whether they're safe or not. Where they're not safe or cannot be made safe, they're already earmarked for demolition, and we're not using them for temporary accommodation. Whilst, where they are, where they're able to be invested in to make them safe, we're doing so. As Councillor Dennis said earlier, Taplow, which had been empty until now, we're now investing money into it to turn those voids around for people to live in them. But it's not just about doing the dwellings. It's about investing in the block to ensure that it is safe, because we cannot have people live in them without doing that. So from what we know at the moment, with all of our requirements, whether statutorily or otherwise, there is nothing that tells us that blocks we're using for temporary accommodation today, we would not be able to use until we have to demolish them.
I think that's a fair point, but I think it's also a fair question from Councillor Altry, in the sense that we know from experience not everything goes according to plan.
Correct.
There's always delays. There's always other factors that come into play that you can't immediately assume will or will not happen. So I think it is wise in the medium to long term to have some sort of contingency. I think that would be good, a prudent thing to do. But anyway, we'll come back to that, I'm sure, in one way or another. So I've got Councillor Johnson.
It was just a bit of a quick question. You mentioned earlier about the inspections you need to do now on the tall blocks, is it?
Correct.
You've got to pay for it from another not a company, government agency, or however that works. Is there a plan potentially in the future, or is there lobbying from Southwark and other local authorities that actually we're able to get people to be accredited and bring that kind of work in-house? Because if it is such an expense and it wasn't budgeted for, this was coming a couple of years ago, surely it would make more sense that us as local authorities be able to have that expertise, which I'm sure we probably do have people who are more than capable of doing it, but don't necessarily have the right title or from the correct agency to be able to sign off those works. So we wouldn't have to keep paying for those things in. I imagine it's not a massive thing, but in terms of, I'm sure it's cheaper to pay someone to do that and something else than it is to have to constantly be buying in those kinds of services when you already have them there.
I can see that happening in reality, because it would be like marking our own homework. The people we have to pay to do this is the building safety regulator, which is affiliated to the Health and Safety Executive. So their job is to make sure that we as landlords are doing everything we're supposed to do to make those blocks safe. And therefore, they're not likely to delegate that responsibility to us. I'm not saying they won't, but they're not likely. But I'll tell you something funny. Because they have been overburdened by the number of assessment they've had to do, they have requested help from local authorities across the country, but it is the building, not the building safety team, building control. So they've requested help from building control teams across the country to help get rid of the backlog. But building control, as you know, even though it's within the local authority, it stands alone as its own authority, and therefore can provide that assurance. But delegating it to the landlord, I doubt it somehow.
No, thank you for that, because I understand what you mean about marking your own homework. I think we should always have some external type input at times, but it does seem, if you've got to do every single building, it does seem, like I said, an excessive burden on that particular agency, and maybe there is a way in the future that we can come to a space where they do random inspections and the building control team would take over if they have their own independence within the council.
If I may explain, Chair, to be clear, the inspections are done by us. Yeah, we have a responsibility, to inspect all of our blocks, whether they're high-rise or low-rise, but the high-rise is in a particular way. What the building safety regulator does is look at the results of those inspections, yes, against their own, processes, and then either issue a certificate to say, yes, that building is safe or not. And if not, tell us why not, and then we would need to do something to make it safe. So they would only come out and do an inspection in exceptional circumstances, but they are the ones who issue the certificate to say that the building is safe.
Clear? Yeah, sure. We're good at that. Okay. Is there any other questions to the members and director? No? Well, I just wanted to obviously thank you for coming and presenting and answering the questions, but also to say, you know, compared to those members of the committee that were here 2 years ago when it first presented itself, you know, getting the recovery plan together, we've made great strides, absolutely great strides. And I want to thank you for all your individual contributions to that. But, you know, I mean, we were looking at decades almost to get the HRA back into a sort of reasonable position. And that in a couple of years is absolutely amazing. So I think, you know, you all deserve our thanks. So thank you very much. Okay. And we've got another 50 questions here. But all right. Thanks again. Cheers. Okay, what I propose is if anybody's got any immediate recommendations, they can move them now. Otherwise, obviously, we're coming back tomorrow evening, so we'll have a good day to think about any recommendations in more detail, and we will consider other recommendations then. But if anybody has got anything immediately, please feel free to speak now. Has anybody?
Tomorrow's fine.
Yeah.
Sorry? Yes.
Yeah,
okay,
you know, the one on I've just gone blank.
Fill it in tomorrow.
There was one on the EDI, the Equality Impact Assessment for the introduction of the SAP system. I think that seems like a logical next step for us to recommend, because it's quite a significant saving, and it will be just, I'm sure that the assessment will be glowingly positive in terms of the impact, but it would still make sense for us to have that assessment done for us, given how much we're saving. I think it's over $1 million.
Is it over $1 million? 600,000.
600,000. Sorry, 600,000. Sorry.
Anybody else? No? Okay. So we reconvene tomorrow, 6:30. Is that correct? Yep, good. And I'll see, well, most of you all then. Okay. Cheers. Thanks again for coming today.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Bye.